Blessed be everyone. Hello and welcome to another episode of Black Magic Talk. Today we have the wonderful Jon Sharp with us today. We're going to find out more about him and do a little bit of shameless plugs before I have to go. So, Jon, how are you this evening?
I'm good, actually, given that it's just gone 2 in the morning here, but I'm remarkably awake, heavily caffeinated. So,
Yeah, it's only about 9 o'clock our time. That's in the United States. And it should be about, 6 o'clock over in your mat? About 6:05, 6 something.
Yep.
Okay, Jon. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got on your path.
okay, so I mean, I'm 54 now, so I'm getting old. But it started, I would have
Nah.
been oh 13 or 14, and came across, it's the most bizarre thing, came across a copy of Crowley's Magick in Theory and Practice, the Castle Books version in a secondhand bookshop. And I'd been I'd had some odd experiences from quite an early age. So I was kind of primed to be interested in it. Bought that book, took that home, did that work. Went to university, joined a Wiccan group at university. That was in Devon. So lots of being skyclad on Exmoor, just outside Exeter, which when it's cold, that's not a huge amount of fun. Went from there to joined a version of the Golden Dawn. I mean, the Golden Dawn's really interesting because you've got the original Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, sort of founded 1888, which weirdly, it's the same year that Jack the Ripper starts. Well, I'm sure there is no connection. They're not setting hairs running there, but interestingly, William Westcott, who was one of the founders, was also a coroner. That's a rabbit hole you can go down if you want to. And then, of course, in the 20th century, you get the Chick Cicero Golden Dawn. There was the Griffin Golden Dawn. I joined Golden Dawn Temple in Nottingham, and I left that because all of the focus was on a legal argument between these two groups over who owned the copyright, and it just didn't feel very magical as a process. And then I joined a Freemasonry group, and met someone in that group who was involved with running an organization that did chaos magic training online. And they did a course on runes, and the person that ran that course was also very involved with the Rune Guild. And I've always been intellectually interested in the whole issue of non-ordinary consciousness and what that is and what it does and what you can do with it. But it was only really with the runes, which is unfortunate because I can't say my R's. So my first name's actually Christopher, but I learned at an early age, don't say that because you will get beaten up. So I picked my middle name instead. So, but then ended up, of course, being drawn to a thing I can't pronounce. And that, I mean, it's the classic cliche of it felt like coming home, but there's no other way of putting it because it did. So joined the Rune Guild. Up until that point, I'd been working with various systems, sort of quite eclectically. That whole sort of notion of belief is technique. It's just another technique that you can deploy. Stopped using anything else, just really focused on that approach. Ended up, as Matthew will know, being a master in the guild, and my masterwork was essentially a very shrunk down version with some practical elements added in of my doctoral thesis. So as far as I know, at the moment, I think I'm still the only person in the UK with a PhD, not in magic. There are lots of PhDs in magic, but they're usually sociological studies or they're historical studies, whereas mine was a study as a reflective practitioner. So it was a philosophical PhD, but always referring back to my own practice. And when I suggested that to my supervisor, it's like, we're going to really struggle to get external examiners for this because this isn't usual. But I knew what I wanted to do. So I did that. That took a few years. My external examiner was Ron Hutton, who you may have seen on sort of TV shows about things like Wicca. And he is in real life just like he is on the TV. It's like being examined by someone from the 19th century. So past that, since then, I need to be careful how I say this. I'm not saying thinking about this stuff isn't important, but what's really important is the doing. So that was a whole load of work really to create a mental structure that would allow me to do what I wanted / needed to do. I think one of the problems with the difficulty of living in the sort of system we live in is that everything becomes a commodity eventually, even spirituality. There's a really good book called Selling Spirituality, which just looks at from the 1960s onwards just how that has shifted, and something that was sacred becomes a marketable product. And the reason why I wanted to do a PhD is sort of twofold. A, because I vigorously believe, because of the experiences I've had, that this isn't just flaky silliness, which is in a university environment when you say to people, and they will say, oh, what's your PhD? So I'll say Magick. They go, oh, is that sociological study? It's like, no, it's about what I do. And then they look at you as though you've said, I kill children. Which, of course, some people think is what we do. We leave that for the church to focus on. So it's it's a weird thing working in the university and being known for being the weird person in the university. But I wanted to set out a framework that legitimized it, not because it needs to be legitimized, but when people say it's just self-indulgent or it's utterly subjective, or the sort of popular thing at the moment is this notion of magic is what we had before we had religion, and then we got rid of religion post Nietzsche because we killed God, and now we have science, and that isn't what it is. So I sort of really dry philosophical terms, what I wanted to do was have an ontology and an epistemology of magic, which is just another way of saying a theory of what exists and how do we recognize something as existing rather than not existing, and what is it that we can know, and what are the ways in which we come to know things. That was really, in a nutshell, that's all it is. And essentially it was just trying to sort of demonstrate that there are ways of knowing that aren't based in the use of purely our normal senses. And it's entirely sensible. And the weird thing now is, if you look at the sort of the bleeding edge of science, which is obsessed at the moment with simulation theory, and are we all in a simulation? The big problem with simulation theory is the sort of notion behind that is, well, any sufficiently technologically advanced society will create computers. Computers create simulations. There will always be more computers on a planet than there are planets, by definition. And therefore, there will be more simulations than realities. And it flows from that you're therefore more likely to live in a simulation than you do in a reality. The big problem with that is it's circular reasoning, because all of that is based on the idea of what we've done. But if we are a simulation, then what we've done is no indication at all of what actual civilizations on actual planets might do. So if we are a simulation, the fact that we've created simulations isn't a good argument for us being a simulation. and vice versa. If we are not a simulation, but some other systems have them or don't have them. And so when you work through it, what you end up actually having to recognize is that we're a unique planet with unique entities living on it. And what we do or don't do doesn't necessarily imply anything about what any other inhabited planet might do or not do. But what it's really trying to address is the fact that the standard model is broken. The standard model for science doesn't work. They know it doesn't work. They sort of acknowledge it quite freely now. I read a really interesting book by, interesting enough, a Christian apologist who's also an academic, but it was a really good book. And he had this great line in there that simulation theory is science's way of trying to escape God. So they have said for centuries now, people who are pure scientists, there is no designer. It looks like there is a designer. Well, it can't be God, so it must be a simulation. But if you take the notion, well, there is a designer, there is evidence of design, or there is the appearance of what we would think of as design. According to Occam's razor, the simplest explanation that covers all the necessary variables and doesn't add anything in that you don't need is most likely to be the right one. So Occam's razor wouldn't say it's a simulation. That requires a whole layer of extra stuff. The Occam's razor approach would say there appears to be a designer, so there's probably a designer. So then you say, so is that an externalized God? Or you can say, and I think there are two options. You can either say, well, there's an externalized God or gods of both multiple or indeterminate gender, because God's a problematic term in and of itself. Or you say the reason there is a designer is because each one of us is a point of consciousness, and at some level each one of us is part of a collective design process. That makes perfectly reasonable sense in terms of where today's science is taking us. It also makes sense in terms of very, very old traditions that had all this shit figured out long before we all got ourselves terribly confused. And on that basis, magic and related things make sense. That was a really long ramble, which was just a long-winded way of sort of going through. That's where I sort of started. So it started, I should probably say this isn't something I've shared that widely. I would have been 5 and I was in my back garden and I encountered an entity. What I now refer to as the hidden folk, because that covers it quite neatly in terms of sort of Northern European pre-Christian tradition. They have loads of different names, but this was not human, but it was a person, and it was sort of both physically present and not. And I had this very meaningful encounter. And it might have been an overactive 5-year-old's imagination, but for me, I'm quite a rational person. I'm quite ASD, so I have a certificate diagnosing me and everything. So I tend to be very rational about things, but this was definitely something. And then everything just sort of flowed from that all the way up to doing a doctorate, which was an important thing to do, but not as important as doing the masterwork, because the masterwork was about actually doing things. And this is the other thing. It's like anything else. People get interested and they feel like, well, I can't get started yet. I need to read some more books because I don't know what system I believe yet. So I need to read some more books. And then they'll go, oh, but that system looks really good. So I'll go and follow that system for a bit. But so I don't get started yet because I don't know everything. But some of the most powerful stuff, if you go all the way back, at some point, some human person started doing what we would now call magic. And they didn't have a book. The books came later. And they didn't have a system, because the systems came later. It was probably a scenario where they're in a life-threatening scenario and they have this urge to survive. And in that urge to survive, that huge expression of will, they survive and then reflect and think, well, I did something then inside myself and that changed the outcome. Because threat, it's not a popular thing to say these days, but threat is not necessarily a bad thing. It's through threat that we seek solutions. If you think about it in terms of the runes that really drive new things in creation is Hagalaz, which is hail, which is destructive as much as it is useful because it brings water when it melts, and Nauthiz, which is a need fire. It's not a need want, it's a fire. It's a you have to do it. So I think people who are interested in this stuff just go and do stuff. People get also hugely obsessed with lineage bollocks. I mean, I found that with Wiccan stuff. I found it with the Golden Dawn. Oh, well, we're the best group because Israel Regardie founded the temple that the guy that founded this temple founded. And it's like, so it's rather like people who are on the extreme right politically. Interestingly, the extreme left do it as well. And from a spiritual perspective, all politics is poison. With this notion of, if you're on the extreme left, but my ideological parent says I should believe this, therefore it's good and true, rather than thinking it through for themselves. And on the right, it tends to be, but my ancestors were awesome, therefore I am. And it's like, no, you are not, because you haven't done anything. You're just sitting on the coattails of somebody else. So lineage doesn't matter. It doesn't mean anything. And tradition as well. In the Germanic side, we tend to get very hung up on the idea of, is it traditional? So there's an absolute link between radical traditionalism, people like Evola, and this particular path. Now, interestingly, I would describe myself as a radical traditionalist. However, and there's a big fucking however in this one, which is that radical traditionalism does not necessarily have an ideology with it. Ideology, as I already said, ideology in any context is not useful to what we're trying to do. And traditionalism doesn't mean something is good because it's old. And that tends to be how it gets dressed up. So you either get people who are really involved in dress up rather than being a traditionalist. And I get the idea of you put something different on when you're performing some kind of important magical work and it transforms who you are. That has a real power to it. I do that myself, depending on what particular thing I'm doing. But the idea of the sort of the full-on reconstructionism, I think, is missing the point, because there was some really bad stuff that people used to do centuries ago. I mean, generally, society didn't treat women particularly well. It didn't treat people who were different in any way at all very well. We just stuck leeches on people for pretty much anything that was going wrong with them, fed them liquid mercury once we discovered that. None of these things were smart. But if you think of traditionalism as not being about the stuff that people did, but about the fundamental values, and that those values are still important, and then you start thinking about the idea of there are such things as universal truths. There are truths that transcend humanity. There are ways of being that are necessarily useful and important, and they're not actually about becoming individually powerful or anything like that. They're kind of dull in a way, but they are really important. Like, have compassion, treat people decently, reflect on things, don't regard yourself as superior to animals or plants or anything else, inanimate or animate. All of those things are traditional values, and they are important. So that's my bag, so to speak.
Very, very interesting. And I like that it was long because, again, we're here to talk about you. So I hope you like talking about yourself.
Matthew will know I struggle not to talk. I talk, which is good. Working in a university, they like talkers, so it's handy. But no, I could, and especially talking about this sort of stuff, because A, I've been interested in it for like forever. B, I genuinely think it is the most important thing anyone can do with their life. And
Right.
by that, I don't mean go and study the runes. I don't mean go and join the Rune Guild or join any organization, because there's a massive problem with thinking that. If you think that, it's a little bit like most people who are, and again, another good example of why politics has nothing to do with what we do, is there's this weird little sort of paradox. So we live in democracies. People vote. And they vote because they think we should live in a democracy. But if you support a particular political party, you believe that party should always be in power because you support them. So you don't really believe in democracy, because in your ideal world, the other party would never be there.
Right.
Which
And both
we all
parties
know,
are shit.
yeah, they're all crap. Now, the problem with spiritual systems or mystical systems is the minute you start getting into one true wayism and thinking, well, my system's the best system and everyone should do my thing, you're starting to fall into that same trap. The fact is, and again, I think there's value in every system. I mean, including things, sort of monotheisms like Christianity. I mean, I loathe the church and the things that it has done and continues to do. But the texts, most of which, of course, it decided in the Council of Nicene it didn't like, because they said things like, well, maybe Jesus wasn't the Son of God. In fact, most early Christians would have laughed that idea out of court.
He was maybe a witch.
But a lot of the, well, yeah. Well, it's some really interesting stuff. For example, what does it really mean when he's raising someone from the dead? Are they really dead, or is that an initiation ceremony? For example.
Necromancy.
Yeah. So, well, talking of necromancy, there is one of the apocryphal texts that's not in the accepted New Testament, but was absolutely originally there for very early Christians. When Jesus is a kid, he kills someone, and then he gets told off by his mum, and he has to bring him back to life. That didn't make it into the final edit for fairly obvious reasons. But in the Bible, there's that great line where it says, my Father's house has many mansions. Someone asks him about the nature of heaven and how you get to heaven. And that sort of sums up my view. It's not about there is a system that is the right system. There are lots of different people, which is great. And different people need different systems. So if the thing that works for person A is Wicca, do that. If for someone else it's Sufi mysticism, do that. Or Buddhism, do that. Whatever works for that individual is the right thing to do. The only time it's wrong is when they're not growing. is when they've picked something that allows them to be exactly who they've always been. Because one way I think you can tell, not is it a good system, any system can be good, is am I using the system properly? Are things happening that are really difficult for me to deal with? Am I having to accept things about reality that are uncomfortable? If everything that you encounter fits your preconception of truth, then you're probably not doing the work. What you're doing is you're just reinforcing your own internal biases. So I think any system can work. And although when I did my doctorate, it uses, because you need to have something to base it on or it just becomes hideously vague. So it's based within the Germanic tradition, the idea of working with the runes, using practical techniques like Galdra magic and stuff like that. But the underlying ideas in it, you can apply to anything, because the basic idea is, and this got a little bit, it was the one moment of my exam that got a little bit squeaky, because there was a point where, I mean, you sort of half expect, if you decide you're going to work with the runes rather than any of the other systems out there, we all know the associations that some people bring to the runes. So it wasn't Ron Hutton that asked me, it was the other external, who was a guy from Gothenburg University, Kvedel something. He's actually done some papers about the Rune Guild, which are no, his name's gone out of my head again. Anyway, he said to me, "Oh, so are you a fascist?" And I was like, is that relevant? Because I'm not. But if I was, provided the thesis stands up and I can defend it, that's irrelevant. If it stands on its merits, it stands on its merits. But no. And he said, well, it's just that you reference Evola a lot. And I also used another philosopher, Giovanni Gentile. The problem with Giovanni Gentile is he was unfortunately known as the fascist philosopher. So he influenced a lot of Mussolini's thought politically. However, the thing with that one is, but what was he actually saying about the nature of reality? Because those two things don't have to be connected. And the reason why I was really interested in his approach, and if anyone's interested in philosophical approaches, the philosophical idea is it gets called two things. It either gets called actualism or actual idealism, or actually there's a third version where they call it ideal actualism. Classic philosophical bump. What it boils down to is the notion that first and foremost, it is true that we cannot for certain know that anything exists outside of our own, if you like, our own mental activity. So we are aware of being consciousness, but we can't objectively demonstrate that anything exists outside of that. And that's your classic idealist position. But he then goes on and says, however, we appear to inhabit a world that responds to the things that we do in it. So it sort of makes sense to act as though that is real, whatever real means, because even if it were not real, would it make any difference to the nature of our experience? And the answer is it wouldn't. He then goes on and makes the point that to the extent that it is actual, then thinking is an actual act. So we have historically done this thing where if I go and dig a hole, that's physical work. If I think about digging a hole, that's something different. But if we inhabit a physical world and brain processes are physical processes, then thinking is actually just as much a physical process as digging a hole is. It's just less visibly so. And the other point that he makes is that if the world is essentially constructed by consciousness, then whichever consciousness is dominant, and you can immediately then see why it gets into territory that people with stiff right arms might like if they misuse it, whichever consciousness is dominant will construct reality. So all consciousnesses are participating in the construction of reality, but only some are actually actively shaping it. Now, Jon Sharp isn't remotely interested in magic. He's not writing about magic. But in the same way that I've always thought that when you read Nietzsche, a lot of what Nietzsche writes about could really be applied to mysticism. Nietzsche himself would have regarded himself as absolutely the opposite of being a mystic. But a lot of what he wrote really made sense in that context. And similarly, there's another philosopher, Edmund Husserl, who is the founder of phenomenology. So most people are sort of aware of the French philosophers of the 60s are sort of the cliche philosopher, sort of talking about, is this real or not? People like Sartre, who are existentialists. That comes out of phenomenology. And Husserl wasn't a mystic, wasn't religious at all, but he also had this notion of you can't really prove that anything other than your experience and your intentions towards your experience are real. And we sort of, that's intrinsically true, right? So he says, but what we want to do is we want to get back to the things in themselves, as he called it. And he said, the way you have to do that is by bracketing off, it's called epoche, because you can't do philosophy without silly terms. So rather than actually saying bracketing stuff off, he called it an epoche moment. But that's all it is. You're just basically going, I'm going to strip away all the things that I bring to this experience from my preconceptions and my preperceptions to have that experience purely in itself. And if you then dig into that, sort of what he's describing is a sort of experience that those of us that practice meditation or trance work have in that state. So my answer to my external examiner was a big no. No, I'm not. And then I, of course, explained why I'd use them. And the reason for bringing that up is, again, it's that thing of there's really useful stuff everywhere. And we shouldn't not look at things because either the person that wrote them was dodgy, because there's lots of really good stuff written by really dodgy people. And Allison Wonderland is one of the cleverest books ever written, especially as a children's story. The guy who wrote it was an absolutely appalling human being. So you've got to separate those things out. And there is a difference in my head between using good ideas that bad people may have written down and using good ideas to try and promote your own bad actions. That's the issue. It's about not engaging in bad actions yourself. And I think the worst and most common thing that people involved in the esoteric tend to do is when you're doing something that most people don't do, and then you realize that, shit, this stuff actually does work. Because there's that moment for pretty much everyone of, I'd like it to work, I'm not sure if it works. And then you do stuff and you find it does work. The next step that's really hard to resist is then people can just develop the largest ego. It's why so many occult groups, they've got titles and belts and robes and sashes and God knows what coming out their ears, because everybody needs an ego boost. So everyone has, I mean, it was, if you think about it, in some ways, it's the origin of participation trophies. Everybody has to be special. Everybody's got to be a magus. And it's not about that, actually. The one thing I've found, the more work I've done, is it's better to get smaller. The smaller you are, the more you see, the more you can hear, the more you experience. And it's obvious from the most basic stuff that anyone who's involved in this work does. The first thing, whatever system you pick that you need to learn how to do, and everyone learns how to do it, is some form of meditation, some form of inner stillness, sort of shutting up the monkey chatter in the mind, which for someone like me is really hard, but it took a long while to get there. And so if the basic of any of our systems is about being still and being open to what is around you rather than projecting yourself into it, it sort of follows that if you get caught up in a notion where it's all about you projecting yourself out into the world, you've probably missed a step somewhere. And I don't think that can then end up dissolving into a left-hand path versus right-hand path type argument. I'm a big fan of, this is very British, isn't it? The middle path. We won't take an extreme position on anything. And it might be fence sitting, but then you could call that hedge sitting, which would be quite ironic because of hedge riders, who were, of course, sort of, it's a traditional term for cunning folk / witches were hedge riders. Because I think either extreme takes you in unuseful places. If you do sort of go down the extreme right-hand path and you think that insight, I'm sort of resistant to the term enlightenment because there's always more that you can know, but insight's important. If you only want insight into the things that look clean and shiny and pure, whatever that is, you end up with a real partial understanding of the world and of yourself. Equally, if you just want to look at the left-hand path, you miss out on stuff that's actually really important, like laughing with people and being joyful and having compassion and helping others. There's a bit of a kind of what's the internet terminology? I'm old, so I'm catching up. There's a bit of an edgelord tendency, I think the term is, in some of these people on this who just want to be on very left-hand path. It's like, okay, that looks as though it's important to you what other people think of you, which means you've got an awful lot of work to do. And magic is about power. It absolutely is. But people don't misunderstand what that means. So if influencing other people or structures or systems is a necessary part of my existence, I don't have a lot of power because my existence now depends on those people and structures and systems accommodating what I want. Real power actually is when you don't need to influence anything because you're complete to yourself and to those people with whom you associate. So I don't think it's wrong for people to think that part of the aim of magical development, and where it is in some ways different to purely spiritual development, is about developing power. I think what happens is people think that's about making stuff happen the way I want it to. And actually, I think it's more about being able to look at the world and saying, well, it doesn't really matter what's happening. It's still interesting. Like there's a large part of me would prefer this didn't happen because it would be inconvenient apart from anything else. If I go out tomorrow and fall under a bus and lose both my legs, in some senses, that would be a pain. But there would then be a whole set of interesting things that I would discover. And if you just approach everything as this is interesting, and the trick, I think the real trick to all of this is, do you really believe it or not? And I think most of us manage to believe it some of the time. But if you believe it all of the time, then when you are seeking to do something where you might need to influence some outcome, and sometimes you do need to, then it is more likely to work. And B, the more consistent you are, the more success you will have. And if you do really believe it, then you have to, and this goes all the way back to the whole reason why I wanted to do this, PhD, is it's that notion of people who are sort of hobby magicians. I'm a magician on a Saturday. So on a Saturday, I believe that the universe can be influenced through the power of my will, and because I will engage in this particular working. But Monday to Friday, I'm going to act as though I live in a normal, empirical, objective universe. That's not going to work for people. It's not going to help them grow. So if you really do fully believe it, then everything is consciousness. So everything is just a way for us to be curious about the nature of existence. So anything that happens is there to be explored. And that really is all of it. It's one of the reasons why I do like the sort of the Germanic mystery so much, because that idea of Runar as mystery, and the key thing being, it's not a God figure where you go, oh, this is God. And of course it's a bloke, because bound to be a bloke. And God made the entire universe and all the laws of physics. He also really cares about what clothes you wear and whether or not you have a foreskin. That's like really important to him. And what meat you eat, because he's very focused on the detail, right? So you can go down that route, and that feels like a bad choice that's not really going to help you grow. Or you could go down the route of saying that you're just going to be always seeking mystery and knowing that you'll never find it, because the closer you get to it, the more it goes away. And there's a really nice practical analogy for this. It's a bit like, I'm not going to go all X-Files at this point, but it's a bit like the UFO phenomena. So I was talking about this the other day. There was a period of time where the technology we had was insufficient to capture something should it exist. So anything that was captured could be denied because, well, it's so fuzzy and it looks like a saucepan lid someone's thrown in the air. To be fair, quite often it was a saucepan lid someone had thrown in the air. Then we now have the technology where if such things exist, you could adequately film them.
Are you talking about Bigfoot?
It could be anything like that.
Okay.
But then people can now say, oh, but we've got the technology to really convincingly fake that. So in the same way that mystery always, you can get close to it, then it moves away. Almost everything that is liminal, you'll never be able to grab hold of it, because there'll always be a way of saying, if someone chooses to say, well, that's not real. That's just your imagination. So you shouldn't worry about what anyone else thinks. You should just be massively curious about everything. And if you fully believe, whatever system you choose, you fully believe the idea that there is something to the idea of the transpersonal. There are entities that exist that have their own intentions potentially that are not human, that consciousness persists whether or not we physically are present, and that consciousness is what drives the universe, then doesn't really matter if you fall under a bus, if whatever happens. And it doesn't mean that nobody out there is going to go through life and never get fed up with stuff and never get angry about stuff or never get upset, because we are human. And there's a value in having those negative experiences as much as the positive ones. But I think a really important part of the work that we do, it's not all about having peak experiences of non-ordinary consciousness. A lot of it is about you actually just become better at dealing with life and being alive, which, given that is a massive struggle for most people, it's something we shouldn't underrate. That is actually really important, and it makes what we do more real. If you say to someone, if you actually work with any system and you work with it seriously, you will find that I know you get less worried about your kids and also less frustrated with them because you see things from a different perspective. Doesn't mean that they're not going to pee you off massively at times, because they will, because they're children. That's what they exist for. But that you will manage it more. That's going to get more people interested in saying something that is equally true, that if you follow this system and take it seriously, you will get more insight into the nature of the universe at a sort of mystical level. Because for a lot of people, until that happens, that just feels beyond, not something they can engage with right now. And the one thing that is missing from a lot of people's lives at the moment, everybody knows their lives are unsatisfactory right now. That's why we buy so much crap that we don't need. And then because we didn't get what we wanted from it, we'll buy more of it. And it's in the system's interest to not let people know the thing that's missing, because they want you to keep buying more of this stuff. And the thing that's missing is a spiritual dimension. And so whilst we might be regarded by many people as weird or flaky or not having any kind of solid basis to what we're claiming, it is really important that esoteric groups continue, whatever flavor they have, whether it's sort of a hermetic system or something that's completely brand new and just made about somebody's head. It really doesn't matter. The important thing is that there are still people saying, actually, all of this physical focus, it's not bad in and of itself, but if that's your only focus, that's why your life is feeling shallow and a bit hollow and a bit unrewarding. And if you focus more on a spiritual, mystical path, life just becomes better. I mean, some of this stuff is really, that's what I like about it. It's very, very practical. There's a great line, I think it's in his Confessions, where Crowley has this very peak experience and describes it as darkness with twinkles, which is incredibly mundane. And that's the other thing about what we're all trying to do is, I like a good book as much as the next person. I did a PhD. You've got to like books. But in some senses, we've got too many. There are too many books. There's so much stuff you can read. And the nature of what we're trying to achieve, by definition, you can't write down. Because if there is any truth to the idea of something in the transpersonal, that there is something greater, then it can't be properly represented through language, because language is created by people and people only. So when you have those encounters with something that is more, you can't represent it fully in language. All you can ever do is point at it, which is why I think most esoteric systems use symbolism. And they don't use that symbolism in a one-to-one relationship with the idea of this symbol is this thing. It's because the only way you can encounter that thing is to properly encounter it. So it's written into a sort of within the guild as one of the things that people should do. And I think everyone should do some version of this, of just sitting out somewhere, ideally away from people and buildings, be as far away from all of that as you can, and just sit. And not sit and do a thing, but literally just sit there and not. I think the other trick is not to want something to happen or to be expectantly waiting for something to happen, because our brain's very mean. Our brains generally don't like us because the ego's in control, and the ego just wants you to do as you're told. So you want something to happen and your ego says, I'll be really fed up and upset if that thing doesn't happen. If I don't really expect it to happen, I'll be less upset if it doesn't happen. So I'll decide that it's not going to happen. And unless you are a very unusual person, it's really hard to turn that thing off. So as soon as you actively want a thing, especially if you really, really want it, your brain realizes how very upset you'll be if you don't get it. So it's easier for you to decide that you're not going to get it. And then you have actually worked some very powerful magic on yourself, just in completely the wrong direction, because you've just made sure the thing doesn't happen.
Well, kind of like reverse psychology, right?
Yeah. So there is a little trick, which is because time isn't linear, and that again is not some bogus thing. It absolutely, I mean, in the purest sense, time is not real. Time is a symptom.
It's man-made.
Yeah. So the only reason there is the experience of time is because of mass and the way mass interacts and creates gravity, which then creates space-time. But I could get really boring and talk about frames of reference and things. Like there's the weird thing with as you get close to the speed of light, no, it'll take too long, and it's not related to what we're talking about. But what I would say is
we have about 4 minutes left.
Right,
So go ahead and finish your point, and then we're going to do some shameless plugs real fast. So go ahead.
Right, I'll be quick.
Finish your point.
Number one, look up speed of light ladder going into a building. It's a real mind bender, really interesting. But go back to the main point. God, what was I talking about? It was definitely going in a direction. I've completely lost my time. Yeah. So I'm gonna how long we got? 4 minutes. I will cut this very
3
short.
minutes. 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Because I think what is really, really, really important is don't read books. Well, no, not don't read books. Don't treat books as though that is what you need to do. Write your own
Don't
stuff.
treat them as gospel, basically.
Yeah. So you could read a ritual or a working in a book, and it might be great, but it's not yours because you didn't write it. If you take the ideas in it and you write your own, you've immediately made it more yours, so it'll work better. However, and this isn't a contradiction, even if it might seem like one, whilst you shouldn't mimic other people's practice, the underlying knowledge and the insights that have been developed over centuries really should be paid attention to. So if we've got, let's stick with the Germanic idea, we've got stacks and stacks of literature that says this is the law around Freya, and then someone racks up and says, yeah, but I had this channeling session and actually Freya's not remotely like that. It's like, no. What you've done there is you've created a new goddess, which is fine. And you might work with them and it might work for you. But it'll probably be really, really hard because this archetype over here has had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of people's will and energy and thought and commitment going into it. So it's like this huge battery already there to be drawn on. And this brand new thing has just got you. So the past can be really helpful as long as we're not bound by it. And then lastly, my one little tip, talking of the past, is the best way to get around that negative loop that happens when you do a magic working and you want a thing to happen and then it doesn't happen because your brain says you'll feel happy if you just accept now it's not going to happen, is put it in the past. So you never say this thing will happen, you say it has happened. Because anything that has happened must happen. And because of the actual nature of time, that is only problematic from our very human perception of how time works. In terms of the way time actually works, it's entirely reasonable for me to now say that something that's going to happen next year has happened, because it has. And if you say that, it's like a trip switch that prevents your fear of success getting in the way. So if there's one little practical tip, it would be that. But far more important than the practical bit, from a sort of what's the point of doing all of this? Why do we do it? Or why do we read all these books and do all these things and have people thinking we're a bit nuts when we're really not? I think the most important thing is if at the end of it all, when you're like 90 or 100 or however old we will all be, when old, because old keeps shifting. Old used to be like me, and now I'm like 54 is the new 30, apparently.
Yeah,
But when
30
you're in
used to
your
be.
yeah, when you're in your sort of 90s, you want to be sitting there and thinking the world is a better, more joyful, more aware place because I've been in it than if I hadn't been in it. And that is more important than anything else. I'm probably butting up against the 4 minutes now, so I will stop there.
So that is the end of our session. We have to have you back on, John, because I mean there were so many questions I wanted to ask you, and then you would say something else, and then I wanted another question I had in my mind. But yeah, we definitely have to have you back on. I just want to do some shameless plugs real quick. Because John, I have 3 shows. I have this one and then 2 other ones. On Pro Wrestling Talk, we're going to talk about some things that happened. The passing of Kevin Sullivan. He passed not yesterday, the day before. We didn't have Pro Wrestling Talk because I was at a family thing. So Pro Wrestling Talk will be on this Saturday, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. John, if you're interested in professional wrestling, we talk about modern wrestling, but then we also talk about old wrestling, because my favorite wrestler is right there.
Now, I could bore you about old wrestling in the UK, which I think is very different to American wrestling.
It is. But thank you for giving us Dynamite Kid, even though he was kind of a bastard in real life. I mean, we love the Dynamite Kid. And thank you for giving us Davey Boy Smith as well. Because he was actually he would hang out with Davey Boy. That's Kurt Hennig. So Pro Wrestling Talk, Saturday, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the US, of course. That is subject to change if one of us has a family function or whatever. But then also, I just dropped a new episode of Kurt Hennig Was the Best, Changed My Mind. It is Kurt's match with Booker T on Nitro in October of 1997. In fact, it was October 27th of 1997, which was 19 years before my son was born. So I was only 11 years old at the time. So it was an interesting time. But we basically I talk about the match because the commentators are too worried about Sting and Hogan. So I mostly talk about the match and they're talking about something else. So that's episode 46. Episode 47 for YouTube people will be the audio only. If you want to head over to Rumble, it will be videos. I have 4 promos that Kurt did, some in AWA, some in Portland. And then we watch the match with him and Luger next week. And then, or it's DDP. No, it's Luger. Yeah, it's Luger first. Luger first and then DDP. That's episode 48. 49 will be it's Luger again and Kurt on Monday Nitro. And then I have 2 special guests. Next week I have Kit Cabello. He's going to be on episode 50. We're going to watch he's a big ECW guy. So we're going to watch Kurt's match with Tommy Dreamer and RVD back in 2002. And then I'm going to have Angel Rivera, and we're going to go over the Big Boss Man's match with Kurt Hennig on Monday Nitro. So shameless plugs, I know. And of course, we'll be back here next week. Matthew, do we have a guest?
We do. Toby Chappell, the author of The Languages of Magic.
Toby Chappell. Okay, so we will definitely have him on next week. Of course, I will be dropping this probably tomorrow at the earliest, since I don't work till like 11 o'clock at my other job. I have literally 4 jobs, so what can I say? I'm just a busy girl. But thank you so much for joining us, John, and thank you, audience, for joining us. Matt, thank you. Matt, is there anything you wanted to plug real fast?
No, I'm good. Thanks for being here, John.
No,
Yes,
thank you
thank
both.
you so
I've
much.
really enjoyed it. Anytime.
Yeah. we definitely have to have you back because I have so many questions, especially about string theory, and then also about like our relationship with money or like a witches, why so many witches are in poverty. If you exclude the "you will own nothing, be happy, and eat sea bugs" agenda 2030. So
Yes, Klaus Schwab.
I'm sure that we could talk all day about that
Oh
one.
yeah.
Trust me, I can talk about that too. But thank you so much, Jon, for coming on. And we'll see you guys next week with Toby as our guest. And blessed be everybody.